Welcome to the latest installment of Scrubbing the Skies, the webinar series of the Institute for Carbon Removal Law and Policy. As always, I'm Will Burns, the host of the show, and serve as the Institute's co-director. The Institute for Carbon Removal Law and Policy was established to provide a platform to scrutinize legal, political, and ethical questions within the emerging CDR sector. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that the voluntary carbon markets are in turmoil. Morgan Stanley recently issued a report warning that, quote, a tipping point may be reached soon in terms of the prices of the voluntary carbon market, given increasing concern about the integrity of the carbon credits being earned in that context. A recent study in the journal Science also indicated that there may be massive overclaiming of credits in the context of RED programs, and a similar result was reached recently in a Guardian article on the company South Pole. And as a consequence, one of the questions that we're increasingly asking in the carbon removal community is what may be the impacts on the scaling of CDR if prices remain low or even drop, and if the public as well as corporations begin to lose confidence in the integrity of the system. Now, in many cases, the analyses that we're talking about are focused on avoided emissions. And obviously, there's a major distinction between avoided emissions and removals. However, given the fact that perception is reality, this nuanced approach may not save the day in terms of carbon removal. And so it's become increasingly important that we mobilize to establish standards that instill confidence in corporations and the public. And today's speakers who are associated with the carbon management company, Carbon Direct, have sought to establish these very standards in collaboration with Microsoft. And I'd like to introduce our guests initially. Dr. Matthew Potts is the Chief Science Officer at Carbon Direct, and Dr. Bodie Cabiyo is the Senior Forest Scientist for the company. Matt, Bodie, welcome. We are initially going to have interventions by both Matt and Bodie to discuss a report that they've recently released in this context, and to more generally discuss how Carbon Direct is seeking to establish standards that ensure both integrity in measuring carbon removals and more generally carbon emissions, as well as how to address issues of justice and equity. As always, I would encourage members of our audience today to start populating the question and answer box. After their initial intervention, I may seed things with an initial question, but then we'll move very quickly to audience questions. And so with that, I would like to turn the floor over to Matt.
Thank you, Will. Great to see everybody here. Great to join and interact with Will in a slightly different venue. Our paths have crossed many a time. And, thank you very much for the kind introduction and, highlighting many of the points about where we stand at this, exact moment in the voluntary carbon market in terms of thinking about how do we evolve it and how do we involve mechanisms. And I think that's an important part of today is how do we think about, to borrow from John Doerr, we bring the speed and scale in. And I think the principles we're going to talk about today have an integral role in both bringing the finance necessary, building the scientific confidence, and getting us closer to meeting the Paris Accords. Next slide, Bodie. So you've met both of us. Those are our wonderful photos. Just to give you a preview of where we're going, kind of dig a little bit deeper into some of the points Will made in terms of the current state of the voluntary carbon market. both in sort of the academic literature as well as in the general popular press, which is being reflected obviously in the current maybe growth or lack of growth in the market. And then talk a little bit about carbon removal. And as Will aptly said, we don't really have a carbon removal market, period, whether we call it a voluntary market or a compliance market. And I really want to build the case. I suspect many of you on this call already understand the need of carbon removal, but just sort of underline that. And then really emphasize the role of buyers, because buyers are the way we activate this market and we build confidence by supporting good projects. And then talk about, the carrots. There's a lot of carrots. I think there's a few sticks that are coming in the policy space, both across the world, EU and Europe and the US, to think about how do we catalyze this market and get it to grow. And then finally, I will turn to Bodie, and Bodie will really dig deep and talk about, what are in these criteria, what are musts, what are shoulds, how are we helping both, we hope, buyers and suppliers in partnership with Microsoft to bring good qualities to market. Next slide, Bodie. So what is the state of the voluntary carbon market? Maybe, I don't know if sadly is the right word, or, maybe I wasn't optimistic enough. I spent the early 2000s working on sustainable forestry projects across the tropics in a country which had a very strong capacity, a long history of forest management, but I still saw firsthand the challenges in sort of managing tropical forests. We all know we need to stop tropical deforestation, but as a global community, we've struggled. We've struggled in sort of how do we design mechanisms, how do we get policies right to sort of think about distributive benefits, figure out who's paying, how these are claimed. And I think over the past couple of years, we've seen this come to a head. I mean, we've seen all the articles, as Will alluded to, the science piece of a couple of weeks ago, really pointing out real problems in the avoided deforestation credits that are on the market today. But I want to highlight another point. I don't think this would have all been possible without, the advent of sort of what we've seen, this data revolution or this data science revolution or this access to big data. In one sense, it allows academics to be able to really dig in, build, sort of natural experiments out of these reams or, gigabits, 10 terabytes of data to sort of interrogate, are these projects having the impact that's claimed? And largely, we've seen no. But second, it gives the public a way to look at this. And then, prospectively, and I think this is something we talk about in the principles themselves, it gives us a way to develop better measurement, reporting, and verification systems. So next slide. So if we look at the carbon market today, actually, we don't have a carbon removal market. We have an avoidance and reduction credit market with only 3% of the credits on the market today actually representing true carbon removals. And, even deeper, and this is part of what drew me to Carbon Direct was, how could I apply the science that I looked at in the land use space to actually evaluate projects? Instead of looking at the criteria that were out there or the verification bodies or the certification bodies as ceilings, let's look at them as floors and let's sort of rigorously interrogate projects. And at Carbon Direct, we've looked at hundreds of projects over the past couple of years, spanning many types of carbon removal, both nature-based, engineered, and biomass utilization. And we found on the order of less than 10%, actually less than 8% of the projects actually meet or exceed our quality criteria. Some of this, they're nascent projects, but some of this is just really, there's challenges in the market. And this is something we, spent many iterations with Microsoft as we, began our journeys like very, very much together at, starting at the beginning of the pandemic and over the past few years. And this is really the impetus. How can we get this 8% higher? But more importantly, how can we get more removal on the market? And next slide, but why do we need removal? Well, one, I can think about, I lived in Miami for a couple of years. I moved to Miami right in 2005, a banner year for hurricanes. I mean, banner is not the right word, but, and I look now, sitting in California and just seeing how storms are intensifying. If we don't act, really to move quickly over this decade on climate change, we're going to face more and more adverse impacts, more variance in weather. We see it every day. But more importantly, and it's sort of, seeping in, I can think of a Nature or a Science, paper recently thinking about ocean currents. It's these irreversible effects. So how do we scale carbon removal, which can be sort of a mitigation effort while we as a global economy work to decarbonize? Next slide. But unfortunately, we can't build enough removal in time, and we probably are not going to be able to fully decarbonize the economy. So two things we need to think about in the use of carbon removal. First, we've acted so slowly to mitigate climate change. We've now sort of, I think, and this is a good picture in the sense of thinking about ice, there's all this carbon that's sort of, what's under the iceberg. We need to actually remove carbon because we haven't reduced fast enough. So that's one thing, and that's required to stay within sort of the Paris targets. And then the second part is to think about these unabatable emissions or these harder to abate emissions at equilibrium. There's, we're working on a SAF market, sustainable aviation fuel, there's long haul trucking, there's these areas that are going to be hard to actually decarbonize. So there may be some residual emissions where carbon removal, they may not be small, can play a very large role. Next slide. And so, going back to my opening point, what is the role of buyers? Sort of buyers are critical in this market. And, by buyers, I mean individual corporations, someday, hopefully consumers, foundations, governments. The scale of the climate change problem means we need to get public capital into tackling climate change, and we need to create the mechanisms to do this. And one of the essential ways to do this is to create standards of carbon dioxide removal to really close this gap. So to orientate people to this figure, in the gray, you can see smallly written there is proposed levels. So these are different scenarios that are out there, and the numbers are in gigatons of carbon per year to meet the Paris relevant scenarios. The key thing to take away from this graph is you can see the arrows, the black arrows, the black lines that are pointed down, whether it be 2030 or 2050. There's huge gaps in what's been pledged or proposed versus what the science is telling us that we need. And you can see whether it's we focus on renewables, we focus just on pure carbon removal, maybe we don't reduce as fast, or we focus on demand reduction. Because remember, this is both a supply and a demand problem. We really need to close this gap. Next slide. And, at home, there's been tremendous growth in renewables, cost parity. We're going to need removable, and it's going to need to scale 20x by 2050 and perhaps 100x by 2050, whether at the low end or the high end of demand, depending on how we meet our energy transition goals and the exact mix, the exact, amount we reduce versus we bring on other sources of energy. Next slide. And, going back to sort of emphasize that point, we started with 3% of, hundreds of millions, billions of, carbon credits out there. There's only 3% of them are removals. But then if you go there and look at who's actually buying, there's a very, very small number of companies, Microsoft being a very, very large portion of that are actually buying carbon removal tons. So what we really set out to do is the science is saying we need to grow this market. How do we grow this market? And I think as I opened up, we need to mobilize capital. And one way you mobilize capital is you create good rules of the road. You create standards as to what good is on the market. You put them out there to the world, and you use that as a way to try to solve this problem. Next slide. And, we're seeing traction there in the sense of, as I said, both carrots and sticks. The sticks, the Securities Exchange Commission, the Federal Acquisition Regulatory Council, rules that are out there that you have to disclose your climate risk, that has to be looked at, made available to the public. So that sort of will spur action. And on the second side, tremendous investments, whether it be in grants or actually in tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act, or more broadly across the world in terms of the UNFCCC, in terms of taking carbon removal seriously and building into frameworks, creating these rules of the road. Next slide. And so, what have we tried to do here? We've tried to create criteria to make it easier for both buyers and creators of carbon removal to create high quality projects. I'm going to turn it over to Bodie now.
Great, Matthew. Thank you so much for teeing up why these criteria are so important. So I'm going to do a bit of a dive into this document that we publish every year with Microsoft. This is essentially a guidance document. So it's 65 pages of guidance across several different carbon removal pathways, and we outline different types of criteria. So we look at additionality and baselines, we look at carbon accounting and MRV, harms and benefits, environmental justice, durability, and leakage. And we really formulate this guidance to cover criteria that we see as necessary to achieve a high quality carbon removal project. So what we've really seen, I think what Will highlighted in the beginning here, is that the existing methodologies are not a guarantor of quality. And we really saw that, as Matthew was highlighting, in the early days with Microsoft, looking at the state of the carbon market and the types of projects that were available. There was a clear need to define criteria both for internal purposes, just to vet where the promising projects were, as well as potentially to develop guidance that could help guide the market in a productive direction. And I think this applies to both projects that have existing standards, as well as projects that are maybe more nascent, project types that are more nascent and don't have existing standards. So over the last 3 years, this document has been used by buyers, companies like Microsoft and other buyers, even carbon brokers that are trying to find the highest quality projects on the market. It's also been used by developers to try to figure out what a good quality project looks like and what buyers are actually looking for in the high quality carbon removal market. It's been used by educators in a few different classrooms that we know of. And we hope that it has been or will be used by registries as well to help lift up the market and the quality of the market as a whole. So by the numbers here, this is the third edition of this criteria document. We started in 2021 with Microsoft, and it's evolved quite a bit over that time. We've added new CDR pathways, we've refined the guidance, and happy to expand on what this evolution has looked like in the Q&A. This is a big collaborative process. This was my first year coordinating the process, and I got a fairly deep appreciation for how many smart folks are involved in this. We counted up over 40 PhD scientists across several areas of expertise, everything from direct air capture to environmental justice to forestry. Unfortunately, we didn't book all of the experts for this webinar, so Matthew and I will do our best to answer your questions. The document is 65 pages long. Most of that document is in specific guidance for the specific criteria or specific pathways for CDR. And we don't actually know how many hours went into this, but certainly more than 100, probably less than 1,000, but a lot of effort. So like I mentioned, there are several different carbon removal pathways that we cover in this document. We have 3 types of forest solutions: forestation, agroforestry, mangrove forestation, and improved forest management. There's soil carbon. There's a new addition this year, which is enhanced rock weathering and croplands, ERW, which was a response to sort of a burgeoning market for that solution. There's biomass-based pathways, which includes things like biochar, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, et cetera. And then there's direct air capture. So again, these specific guidance for these specific pathways covers about 90% of this document. Today, we're going to be mostly focusing on the other 10%. What is the overarching guidance? But we can drill in on those specifics if we want to in the Q&A. So thinking about the kind of the structure of this document, we break up the guidance across musts and shoulds. Basically, the musts are the minimum viable project characteristics. These are the things that we think that all carbon removal projects should have. The shoulds are more aspirational. They're things that are either nice to have or things that just have limited practical application right now. And we can get into a couple of examples of that later. But this is really trying to hit the balance between pragmatic and conservative. In an ideal world, carbon removal projects would meet all of the criteria that we lay out in this document. The reality is that that would mean that the carbon removal market would be extremely small because very few projects actually meet all of the criteria that we lay out here. So that's why we broke it up across musts and shoulds. So I'm going to go forward and dive into some of the specific quality criteria that we lay out across all of the different carbon removal pathways. Again, just to emphasize, the bulk of the document is in the carbon removal pathways themselves. So this is going to focus on kind of the overarching guidance that is true across all of these. So Will, in your introduction, you mentioned the recent Science Journal article that came out by Thales West and colleagues, calling out the difficulty of setting effective baselines in REDD+ projects. Additionality and baselines are absolutely critical in creating high quality carbon projects and carbon removal projects included. So we have a fairly straightforward definition of additionality. We define additionality as removals are additional if they would not have occurred without carbon finance. We also have a fairly straightforward definition of baseline. Baseline is a conservative estimate of the carbon and other greenhouse gas impacts that would have occurred without carbon finance, or the counterfactual. An important thing to note here, though, is that this is an overarching guidance. And so what we're actually saying here is that all types of carbon removal should have a baseline. So if you look at the must criteria, that fourth bullet is quantify removals relative to a baseline. That's fairly intuitive for forestry projects. It's slightly less intuitive for, say, a direct air capture project or some biomass-based pathways projects. One thing that I want to note here is that these must and shoulds are highly paraphrased, so they can fit on slides. They're actually much longer in the real document, but be a fairly boring presentation to just read from the document. Moving forward to the next category of musts and shoulds of quality criteria. We've combined carbon accounting and MRV. This is essentially the carbon math. So there's significant overlap between these two. If you think about carbon accounting is essentially the calculations that lead to how many carbon credits are generated from a project. And the MRV is more or less the data that goes into those calculations. So there's a lot of linkage between the two of them. And there's a lot of heterogeneity between how this is actually done. But you can look, if you look at the must and shoulds, there's there are some things that are fairly consistent across them. Stepping out of the world of carbon math. So harms and benefits are essential for good carbon projects. You can have, obviously, you could have a carbon project that has perfectly calculated carbon removal math, but causes severe social harms or environmental harms. And so what we tried to outline here is how to avoid those social harms, and also, importantly, how to try to pursue benefits with these projects that are not strictly related to the climate benefits of the project. So the harms and benefits here are fairly broad. They get much more specific within the CDR pathways. Importantly, we outline in the shoulds of many of the CDR pathways how you can actually produce co-benefits with the projects. And then jumping forward to what is a very related topic to harms and benefits, environmental justice. So environmental justice was a big focus for us this year. And we put a big emphasis on specifically on procedural equity, which the IPCC defines as equity in the process of decision-making, including recognition and inclusiveness and participation, equal representation, bargaining power, voice, and equitable access to knowledge and resources to participate. So this is really critical, whether you're looking at a forestry project in Africa or you're looking at a direct air capture project in the United States. And we leverage a specific tool here to start to think about how to engage communities, which is the CDC's ATSDR Community Engagement Continuum tool, which specifically outlines sort of increasing level of community involvement and trust building in a project. So this ranges from at sort of the lowest level, just having outreach to a community. Then at the next level, you can consult with a community or involve a community in the design of the project. Or at the penultimate level, you could collaborate with the community in designing the project, or actually have shared leadership in development of the project. So environmental justice is absolutely critical across carbon removal project types, and we wanted to emphasize that in this edition of the criteria for high quality carbon dioxide removal. Moving back slightly into the world of carbon math, durability is a topic that's close to my heart personally. At Carbon Direct, we prefer to use the word durability rather than the word permanence. If for no other reason, just that durability is sort of a more flexible understanding that few things are permanent in this world, and especially in carbon storage, most of the project types that we're looking at don't actually have true permanence. So there's an immense amount of heterogeneity across project types. Of course, durability, the carbon storage term for certain projects can range from decades to millennia if you're looking at soil carbon versus, say, direct air capture with geologic storage of CO2. So for that reason, the overarching guidance here is fairly broad. We highlight that projects should know what their durability term is, how long they expect carbon to be stored. They should have clear monitoring for carbon throughout the length of the project. And they should take clear actions to reduce the risk of reversal, to try to minimize, for example, leakage from geologic reservoirs or reversals due to disturbance from wildfires or things like that. And then finally, in the last criteria for high quality carbon removal, economic leakage or market leakage is essentially quantifying impacts outside of the project boundary. So you can think about things like indirect land use change from a forestry project that is displacing the production of an agricultural good to an area outside of the project. This could be market leakage, so it could happen through through international markets and supply and demand dynamics. It could also be activity shifting leakage, where, say, a project developer is shifting their economic activity to a neighboring land outside of the carbon project. So I think an important observation about leakage is that, and as I understand, this is a fairly academic audience, we actually have really low scientific certainty about leakage forces. So in the world of forestry, there are only a handful of papers that really outline what happens when you shift forestry production out of production, and what the global market forces look like, even the local market forces look like in that kind of situation. So critically here, we wanted to emphasize that as the registries currently do, leakage deductions are important. So yes, you should be reducing a certain fraction of the carbon credits for leakage that's estimated, but it's critical to build leakage mitigation into a project. So for an example of this from the world of pure carbon removal with direct air capture, one of our criteria around leakage is that the project developer should demonstrate that any new energy that's needed for a direct air capture operation does not extend or create new demand for emissions intensive energy. So trying to be really clear here that we can do the modeling, we can take leakage deductions, but at the end of the day, we also need to be proactive about reducing the potential for leakage in the project design itself. So that was a very high-level overview of the overarching criteria. Like I said, most of the content is specifically specific to the different verticals, like forestry or like direct air capture. If you want to dive into those, you can find the report here, and we're happy to take your questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Matt and Bodie. And I'll move to questions in a second. I just have one initial question myself. So in a number of places in the study, there's obviously what I think is a salutary effort to kind of operationalize the precautionary principle, right? Where it talks about conservatively estimating both claims of emissions reductions or avoidance, and also being conservative in terms of how risks are addressed. But from a standpoint of guidance, the term conservative strikes me as a bit vague, right? Is it contemplated that some kind of metrics will be provided that would guide developers in terms of how to proceed conservatively in any of these axes that you're talking about?
I mean, I think that's, a really good point. And I mean, I think you're catching the underlying tone of this being precautionary, conservative. And, I think, there's discussion of how do you, not be overly prescriptive, but too vague where it doesn't become actionable. And I think, if I think about where the journey we started from and where the market is today, if you think about the removal market, that going back to that 3% figure, most of that comes out of the CDM afforestation type projects that date to 2000. So we have very little, reps of like, what did we do with planting trees? That said, over the past 4 to 5 years, if you go back to the Trillion Tree Study, we've certainly been out there planting a lot of trees, but I'm not convinced we're actually, to be honest, doing a lot of the monitoring or developing the plans. And so I think this is, again, how do we translate the science into prescriptive action or implementable action? And I think we're trying to work at this interface. And I would anticipate, future versions of this becoming more prescriptive. I mean, maybe to point at one where I think, engineered, I think, is something we'll get to, but, even thinking about soil spaces, thinking about the innovation in companies and how do you measure soil? How do you do that? We all know it's hard, and you could see that becoming prescriptive as costs coming down. But I think for land projects, I think they're unique. They're with communities. What is conservative? What is precautionary is about a process of engagement, making sure there's equitable, and just things going on. So that may be hard to be prescriptive, but in certain areas in the engineered space and other parts of the nature space, I could see saying, this is the metric you need to get to.
Great, thanks for that. Okay, let's move on to some of the questions from the audience. First is more of a statement, but I guess I'll ask you whether you agree or disagree with it and maybe expand upon it. So the statement is the elephant in the room: most corporations do not have the cash sitting around unused to pay for real tons removed or avoided. What do you think?
I have many answers to that question. I mean, I think that's, at a macro scale, I think this is a big challenge. This is a global environmental externality. We've globally made a commitment to get there. That goes back to my earlier comments of how do you mobilize capital and how do you pay for this? And this is not a webinar. We could go through all the mechanisms that are out there to do that. There's another part of me that says there is a strong desire to take action. And companies have, if you look at the number of science-based target initiative pledges, we could talk about, the role of removals there or the emerging beyond value chain contribution. So there has been public action or commitment to action. And then, now we're in the phase of implementation. And one way I would say it is, and part of what we hope the principles do is motivate, getting the people that hold the purse strings at these companies to take action. And it's not all about taking action. And, you couldn't go out and buy, all the engineered carbon removal you want tomorrow. There's a very, very small amount of tons on the market. What we're trying to do is grow the market. So it's thinking about how can I make those commitments for when these tons come on later in the decade? How can I signal? Because part of what the signaling does is it helps to de-risk the investments. What many of the projects on the market today don't have is access to standard commercial debt where they're getting favorable rates. They're often financing these projects off their balance sheets as startups out of private equity. So the returns that are expected are much different, to use that capital than would be expected in a functioning market. So part of this is just priming the pump and getting it going, but we got to move fast because, climate change keeps getting worse.
Great. Anything to add, Bodie?
Yeah, that was a great answer. Thank you.
All right. Okay, next question. Given the role of all 6 Kyoto greenhouse gases, such as methane, adding to them black soot and indirect greenhouse gases, which result in at least a third of current warming, how do you intend to address the non-CO2 removal market and its governance?
Because I can jump in quickly on that one. So part of the way that we've designed this document is as a response to where we see emerging activity in carbon removal supply. And so I think that's been a driving force behind, for example, the addition of enhanced rock weathering this year. 2022 was the year of ERW startups. There were, I can think of at least 4 off the top of my head that emerged in 2022. And so we added that vertical in response to that supply signal. And I think that's true of other verticals as well. So my broad answer to this is that as soon as it appears that there is a market that is emerging for non-CO2 GHG removal, we will certainly respond to that and try to set guidance for it. But until then, there's so many emerging CO2 removal pathways that we want to include, and can't do all of them quite yet.
Okay.
Matthew, anything to add to that?
Anything to add, Matt?
No.
Okay. So here's a question about what's not in there, right, and why, in terms of approaches. And I guess I'd add a second one to this one. I was curious about. So the question is why oceans aren't included in the report. And I guess my question would be, I know there's a brief section, I think it's under rock weathering on biochar, right? But CDR FYI tells us that biochar is like really the what modest purchases we have are the lion's share of those modest purchases. So I'm curious why there wasn't more granularity and guidance on biochar, and the audience question was about oceans.
Well, let me dig into the oceans. I may let Bodie talk a little bit about the biochar. I mean, I think this is this balancing act here of trying to, again, motivate a market, get people to act, and act in a way that we think has impact versus where the state of the science is. And so, pointing broadly at ocean CDR, I think there are substantial open-ended questions about measurement, reporting, and verification. You in the audience may have similar concerns we have, we maybe personally do often about soils. Maybe the questions are different. There are fundamental questions of governance in ocean systems, given it's a well-mixed system. So I think it's more of a reflection that, we're very supportive behind the scenes of, trying to get this type of CDR off the ground. And it's important to think about how climate, how oceans will play a fundamental role or have in sort of absorbing some of that excess CO2 that's coming into the atmosphere. But we don't think it's ready, and we can't come up with musts and shoulds or a clear enough, picture to do that. Maybe in 2025, maybe in 2020, I guess we're only in 2024. We're hopeful there in, getting there. We're just not quite there yet. And, even rock weathering, remember, that's, this is why rock weathering is just appearing now, is much of what is in the enhanced rock weathering. It may start in a field and, instead of in the, Mississippi, drainage, but it's going to end up in the Gulf of Mexico. That's CO2. So this is this goes to the fundamental challenges, whether it be in many of these technologies, to feel very certain about the removal you're getting. Bodie, you want to chat a little bit about biochar?
Yeah, certainly. And Will, fantastic observation on biochar being honestly a pretty large portion of the supply of durable carbon removal that we're seeing today. So we have this kind of broad section on biomass-based pathways, and that includes really any kind of conversion of biomass, whether it be agricultural residues or forest biomass, into durable carbon storage. And there's a relatively short subsection on biochar in that we pull out the specific considerations. We also include biomass burial, which is an emerging pathway for biomass-based CDR. BECCS. I think we briefly look at bio-oil sequestration. And it's kind of a tricky category, I'll be honest, because while in principle all of the biomass-based CDR pathways are similar, they vary wildly in terms of their engineering implementation. And so I think that one of the things we're thinking about going forward with this document is figuring out how we can provide really practical, useful guidance on those individual pathways while still maintaining kind of the continuity of the document.
Great, thanks for that. All right, next question. How do the standards relate to the standards being developed by the Integrity Council, VCM, and VCMI? Right, we've got a proliferation of standards now, right? And how do they integrate at all, or how would you distinguish your approach from them, maybe?
I mean, I think there's two levels. One, this makes me think of, we should have put this slide in the presentation, the spaghetti diagram, as I like to call it, of all the overarching standards, whether they're compliance, gold standard, VERA, the proliferation of protocols. So one way I see this, and we're, the efforts are greatly needed to sort of bring some uniformity and sort of, maybe try to untangle the knots. But if you think mathematically, knots are complicated things to untie, and some are untieable. So one way I would think is that way is hopefully they're sort of saying above the bottom. What we're trying to do, and this maybe get into this precautionary versus conservative, is figure out where the ceiling is and try to get people as near to the ceiling as possible. And so in the long run, I hope the elevators meet in the middle, or everybody meets us at the top. But, the conclusion now is we, for the vast majority of projects out there, or interventions out there, we just don't feel, based on what we've looked at, is in the sense of the certification verification is enough. And I would say that especially for any land-based project, any large land-based project touches communities, you need to look at it, individually. And so I see them as, related or correlated efforts, just coming at the problem in slightly different ways. Bodie, do you have anything you want to add there?
I think that was a great answer, Matthew. I would also add that, adding to your metaphor of floors and ceilings, I really think of this as a guidance document for pointing the direction of travel for the market as a whole. And importantly, that means that this is not a standard. It's not something that will be a recipe book for a developer to go to and figure out exactly how they're going to do their carbon calculations or exactly how they're going to implement community protections. It's more pointing the direction. And to that end, I really hope that some of the other efforts in the market, like ICVCM or registry methodology updates, can look at this document and get some inspiration from it for how we can push those more detailed methodologies and standards towards high quality, towards that ceiling.
Let me ask you a question that's kind of related to that. Given this proliferation of standards, guidance, and so forth, and the fact that honestly, corporations, if they're rent seeking, right, can pick and choose which standard they want to use, and the public's not going to know. Do you think in the long term we're going to need government regulation that establishes some uniformity in this market to really increase integrity and ensure the viability of CDR in the longer term?
I mean, one obvious answer is yeah, of course. But I mean, I think one reaction is, different parts of the world have different regulatory regimes or different relationships between private and public companies. I think of, even the contrast between Europe and the US, the role government plays. If you think about in France already, you're required to disclose all your scope 3 emissions. So the speed at which this occurs is one question. And then, but the other reaction is, compliance makes it easier. But, Bodie and I, living in California, have seen a lot of struggles in the California, quote, compliance market. And we didn't even really, unpack improved forest management. So compliance markets makes it easier, but that also still requires good science, good regulatory processes, and you can have bad compliance standards. And so, if this is a good incubator to get us to a compliance market, then albeit, but what most important is to make sure we're getting the removals that are genuine out of this, whatever the ending up process to initiate it is.
Okay. All right, next question. What is the threshold value to determine if a CDR project is not a common practice? How is this threshold value determined?
I'll let you start, Bodie. I'm happy to start, but I'll let you start. You're both kind of jumping for it, so.
It's a super tricky one to parse, honestly, and across the different types of carbon removal pathways, it's going to look extremely different. So, just highlighting that spectrum to emphasize the heterogeneity, you could look at, say, a direct air capture project that has almost zero financial incentive and almost zero sort of precedent for common practice outside of a demand for carbon removal credits. On the other end of the spectrum, you could look at, say, like agroforestry practices or other forestry practices that are, relatively common, and or soils, I think, is kind of the classic example of this, where a lot of soils interventions are maybe happen through word of mouth farmer adoption, and the direct linkage to carbon payments is slightly ambiguous. So, thinking across that spectrum, I think that as you dive into the other 50 pages of the report, we have a lot of bespoke guidance for addressing common practice across the different carbon removal pathways. I'm not sure if there's broad guidance that I could give across that spectrum, but it's certainly tricky, and I think has to be fairly bespoke to the solution.
Yeah, maybe just two quick postscripts. One, obviously in the engineered space, there's not much common practice. If we looked at, back on the graph, there's not that many tons on the market. There's a lot of proliferation. So we'll have to revisit what, common practice for DAC or biochar is shortly. And then the thing I'd really emphasize, one of my early remarks is the data aspect. We can begin to look in forestry. Is this common practice? How have they been managing or harvesting, these areas, if we're thinking about improved forest management, or, what is the patterns of reforestation or land use? So I think there is more data to bear to ask in a quantitative sense. And then there is, of course, this challenge in the qualitative sense of what is sort of this common agricultural practice or forestry practice in this region.
Okay. All right. Next question. Could you elaborate on how the environmental justice section of the guidelines is different from other stakeholder engagement standards developed by registries such as the Framework Convention, Gold Standard, et cetera?
Yeah, I can jump in on that quickly. So when I was presenting, I specifically called out the CDC. I always mess up this initialism, but the ATSDR community engagement spectrum. And I think that's a nice example actually to highlight that, where possible, we're trying to leverage existing guidance that has been developed. I don't think there's a need to reinvent the wheel with this guidance. And so, yeah, I think that this document is part of an ecosystem of guidance, and it's not meant to be duplicative or reproduce that guidance necessarily, but we've tried to refer to guidance that we think is the gold standard where we can.
Anything else, Matt?
I mean, I just think, again, going back to this prescriptive, descriptive, it's really trying to highlight the importance of this and highlight, the process by which you go through in doing this, and really emphasizing this as an integral part and why it's really highlighted, why it's ordered in the way it is. I think the two crucial things, or there are many crucial things to a carbon removal project, but one, is it additional when we're stuck in this voluntary world? And two, really, how do you involve the people that are going to be touched, that are benefited and could be harmed by that? Those are the critical questions you have to answer. And then there are a lot of technical questions to really get to the bottom of, how many tons for every dollar spent is this project producing? But those initial questions are critical. Is this a valid, effort? Is this really meeting what we want as a society towards meeting our goals?
Okay. Do you think in the environmental justice context that there may be a requirement in future guidances to go beyond just ensuring procedural justice, right? And ensuring that there's participation by everyone, including the most vulnerable groups, to the notion of substantive justice, right? Ensuring, and I don't know what metrics you use, but ensuring there's not disproportionate impact on the most vulnerable groups. It seems like this guidance document focuses more on procedural aspects, and some in the EJ community would criticize that for not having more of a substantive component. What do you think?
This is a question where I wish we had one of our 40 experts in the room right now. One thing I'll say here, though, is that the focus on procedural justice, or procedural equity rather, was I think really our EJ team saw it as kind of a first step in a growing market. I think that a lot of players or actors in the carbon removal space are kind of getting up to speed and learning how we can best incorporate EJ, and trying to have those conversations. And I think that, yeah, really our EJ team saw the focus on procedural equity as a really valuable first step. And there are many more steps to take in that journey, but this felt like the right starting place.
Yeah, and I'm really glad that you did that, because I agree, it's an integral part of this, and we didn't even pay lip service in some of the earlier incarnations and some guidance. So I'm glad to see it. Okay, next question. This is associated with durability. What are your thoughts on normalizing around radiative forcing, time-valued carbon, rather than requiring longer timeframes for measuring reversals? The questioner says this would be equivalent to handling it the same way we do for non-CO2 gases, as well as substitute quantity for duration in this context. What do you think?
This is a fantastic question, and we could probably spend a whole webinar talking about this question and related questions. For the first thing I'll say, which is a little bit self-congratulatory, but Carbon Direct published a commentary last year on basically different approaches to addressing durability, and we kind of broke it down into this framework of horizontal stacking and vertical stacking. So vertical stacking is essentially, I think, what the attendee here is asking about, which is you can do some math about the radiative forcing or the impacts of say 10 years of carbon storage, and then you can back out how many credits you would need to buy today of that 10-year carbon storage to stack them up today to offset the long-term impacts of your carbon emission that you're offsetting. There's been a lot of really great work on that, a lot of really great discussion. I think from my perspective, that conversation is still very active, and I'm looking forward to seeing where it goes. There's been some great recent work out of LSC, I believe, Frank Van Mensen, Ben Groom, have done some great work on this that I would recommend people read. Horizontal stacking is another way to conceptualize this problem, where essentially if you have a 10-year credit, you could create a mechanism whereby at the end of that 10-year period, you just buy another 10-year credit, or maybe at the end of that 10-year period, you buy a permanent credit. So you create over time, if you think about the x-axis, you create a horizontal stack of credits to offset your long-term emissions impact.
Yeah. Anything else on that, Matt?
No, I mean, I think, very rich subject, big debates. You bring in climate models, both, they bring in the economic models. I mean, I think, to zoom out though, it's really a question of two, going back, if we're trying to buy, get to speed and scale, does, one, creating or using a different way we incentivize or metric, these credits lead to that speed and scale, but also are we really, really confident in the impact? I mean, in some sense, if it's a DAC credit or rock minerals, if you mineralize the CO2, there's questions of availability and price and how quickly we scale. These durability questions sort of disappear a little bit or become manageable. It's sort of this intermediate period, if, you think back, we need to act fast. Nature-based is probably where we are, planting trees, managing ecosystems is where we need to act. And so I think it's a rich discussion we should continue to have, to think about if that helps get the market going, but doesn't allow people to do things that end up creating more problems down the road.
That's the challenge. Here's a related question. Yes or no? Do you believe it is reasonable to offset 1 ton of fossil carbon dioxide with 1 ton removed via a high quality forest project? Why? So not totally yes or no.
I mean, at one level, I think about two things. There's two carbon pools out there, the biogenic and the geologic carbon pool. They're in great disequilibrium. So I think there's a more nuanced question. Can I replace a biogenic emission with another biogenic emission? What we really need to be doing is sort of thinking about, how do I get more CO2 into geologic storage? So in some sense, there's a fundamental incompatibility and disequilibrium between, a offsetting or crediting or canceling out a geologic emission, which fossil oil is, with a nature-based credit. And maybe it goes back to the conversation we were just having, like, maybe you can do it for a year, but if you can buy a DAC credit tomorrow, maybe it's okay. But I mean, I really need, this goes back to, we really need to reduce emissions and then view the removal part as a critical part in that transition, and to deal with, the things we can't abate. Bodie, do you want to add anything?
I was just wanted to emphasize your last point there, Matthew, which is that, like, I think like frameworks like the Science-Based Targets Initiative really emphasize that reductions come first, and then we do whatever we have to do at the end to offset the long tail of our emissions we can't reduce. The other thing I'll add here is just to harken back to some of Matthew's original slides, which call out the fact that in IPCC scenarios, we're looking at gigatons, like many gigatons, maybe 10 gigatons of CDR that we need. That's a lot. And we're seeing some exciting announcements. Like, this week we saw Amazon announced a direct air capture purchase of, I don't want to say 200,000 tons of direct air capture. And that's going to be permanent CO2 storage, which is fantastic. 10 gigatons is a lot. And I think that my personal perspective here is we don't want to throw any solutions out that are good solutions, and it might be useful to try to figure out how we can make bring nature-based solutions to bear in that 10 gigaton sticker price.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question. Will you comment on the proposed SEC regulation concerning climate disclosure? You do mention that in the report also, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a lawyer. I would defer to our lawyers. I would defer to our policy people. But, I think these are needed steps. This is the beginning of the question of, like, how do you create a structure? I think, hearkening back to our opening questions, like, do companies have the financial resources to do this? This creates structure, and structure creates predictability, and it, helps to create, pathways everybody can follow and sort of level the playing field. So these are the types of things we're going to need to be able to get this market to scale and to sort of, as a global community, tackle climate change, or even within the US, tackle climate change.
Yeah, and of course we'll see what the SEC standards look like once they get invariably watered down, right? Which has already started, but it will be interesting to see, because it could be this de facto regulatory structure we're talking about, or at least a portion of it. So the interesting question. Okay, we have reached the bewitching hour. And so I would like to once again thank Matt and Bodie for coming on the show. Interesting observations. I encourage everybody to look at this study, and I think it's laudatory that not only Carbon Direct is looking at this, but that Microsoft seems to be engaging in earnest as a purchaser in trying to develop this framework. So thanks again also to our audience for joining us. We have a rare back-to-back webinar series this week, and so tomorrow we're going to be looking at a recent study that focuses on the potential impact of ocean alkalinity enhancement on coccolithophours and diatoms. And if you're interested in ocean-based approaches and haven't seen that announcement, I encourage you to register for that webinar. And we hope to see you in the future for others in the series. So once again, thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your day. Goodbye now.